able to join us. Hello there, hi, so that people who aren't able to join us are able to catch up with us on our YouTube channel. Just as the last few people start to come through and join us, thank you for taking the time out of your diary to be here. If you're catching this on catch up later, that's brilliant, and please do come back to us if there's any questions on that. In terms of the running order for today, we're delighted that Angus Walker, who's a partner at Bircham Dyson Bell, is going to take us through the new NNMPS and the implications of that for rail freight, and indeed for other developments in road and rail. The NPS, a vital piece of rail freight planning policy, and something that's served us well over the last few years, but obviously with government reviewing the NPS, some changes in there, and a need to keep the success, but also navigate what those changes might be and how they will impact on rail freight. In terms of how we're going to run today, we will be recording this, as I've said, for YouTube. If you want a copy of Angus's slides, I'm assuming, Angus, we're okay to share those.
Yep,
so please just drop me a note and we can get those slides emailed over to you. If you've got questions, please do put those questions into the chat function or the Q&A function, and I'm sure we'll have time for a few questions later on. Judging by the number of attendees we've got, I'm suspecting that the time zone question, which may have baffled Angus earlier, may also have baffled some other people. I have double checked. It is definitely down as 12:30 on my website. So I'm taking chair's prerogative on that. And we'll make sure we get the recording over to people later on. But for meanwhile, I think let us move on. So Angus, I'm not sure that you need much by way of introduction, really, other than to say you're a partner at Bircham Dyson Bell and you've been involved in infrastructure planning for a very, very long time. But we're delighted
making me feel old there.
No, not at all, in a good way. We're delighted to have you with us today. So Angus, over to you, and if you can take us through it, that would be brilliant. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my presentation on the screen. Here we go. Can you see that?
I can. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So what I'm talking about today is the National Policy Statement for National Networks, which is a rather subtle code phrase meaning road, rail and rail freight, because there's a new one out for consultation, and I'm going to, well, let's go on to my next slide. So it'll tell you what I'm going to do. So I'll do a brief recap for those who may not be familiar with development consent orders for very big projects, and then what the purpose of a national policy statement is, then a bit about this consultation and what the differences between the old one and the new draft are, the principal differences as they relate to rail freight. And then perhaps a little speculation as to what could be better. So off we go. So the Planning Act 2008 was introduced in 2008, as the name suggests, and it's a new, it was then, it's probably not anymore really, a new way of consenting very large infrastructure projects. And the Act sets out the size above which projects must be consented with a development consent order instead of planning permission or any other type of permission. So there's different thresholds for all the different types of infrastructure covered by the Act, whether it's a nuclear power station or a reservoir, but it includes strategic rail freight interchanges. The threshold is set out in section 26 of the Act. There's a link there. When you get the slides, you'll be able to click those underlined bits and take you to the source as we go through. Rather a complicated threshold for rail freight. So there's 5 principal features that it must have all of. So it must be in England and be connected to, or proposed to be connected to, the railway network. Must be at least 60 hectares in size. There's a bit of a debate as to what those hectares include. Should they include things like landscaping around the edge of your project? The Planning Inspectorate seems to think, yes, it does include all that. Others may differ. It says the facility must be capable of handling goods from more than one consignor to more than one consignee. So it's not just a single company's project. It must be capable of handling at least 4 trains per day, and it must include warehouses. So this is the same threshold if it's a completely new rail freight interchange, or you've got one already and you're increasing it in size. The increase must satisfy all these things. It is possible, you might think, why the hell would you do it? That if you're below the threshold, you can apply to use the Planning Act by getting a certificate from the Secretary of State for Transport. It is quite an onerous regime, but then again, the Secretary of State is deciding rather than the local authority. You get compulsory purchase powers. There are various benefits of it, so it might be possible. I mean, if the promoters of the St Albans rail freight project had done one of these initially, maybe it would be ready by now. But briefly, these are all the rail freight DCOs that have been consented or are in progress or are proposed by being on the Planning Inspectorate website. So the very first one was an extension rather than a new facility to the Daventry International Rail Freight Terminal. That was way back 9 years ago nearly. I put on second attempt because an application was made, and the Planning Inspectorate has 28 days when you make an application to decide whether it is of a high enough standard that they will deign to examine it. And that one was initially not a high enough standard, so it had to be resubmitted a few months later. But that one was all right, and it eventually got consent back in 2014. Then the next one was 2 years later, East Midlands Gateway. That was granted, even though the inspectors that examined it recommended it be refused. And I'll come on to this a bit later because they were not convinced. They thought that the rail element was just a fig leaf and it would never actually be connected to the rail network, and it was just a way of getting some road-connected warehouses. Nevertheless, the Secretary of State disagreed and granted the DCO. Next one was 3 years later, so they're getting a bit more frequent. The Northampton Gateway one that got in at the first attempt and was recommended for approval, so that one was all right. More recently, West Midlands Interchange, and there is currently one in progress at Hinckley in Leicestershire. That had an earlier attempt and was not accepted for examination, and is now had a successful second attempt, another success in terms of being accepted for examination, and that is in progress. There's one more on the Planning Inspectorate website in Oxfordshire. There was one earlier, or 2 earlier ones that have not got very far. One called East Midlands Intermodal, which did initial steps like getting a scoping opinion, but doesn't seem to have had any activity on the Planning Inspectorate website since about 2016. So perhaps we can conclude that that one's not going forward. And one called Rail Central, an application was made, it was accepted for examination on the second attempt, but then it never actually got going with its examination and was eventually withdrawn due to various problems. So a slightly checkered history of rail freight DCOs, but once you get accepted, you generally seem to get approved afterwards. So that's the history. What about the future? Oh, before we talk about the new NPS, what is the point of an NPS? Worth mentioning that. I would say it does 3 main things. The whole point of the Planning Act regime was so that not to re-argue what the need for projects was every time you made an application for a new project, and to have that declared in a national document that exists that you can just point to. So that's the principal thing that a national policy statement does. It says what the government considers to be the need for different types of infrastructure. Interestingly, it's For energy, there are also some draft energy national policy statements that come out, and they've declared that for offshore wind and pylons connecting it onshore is a critical national priority. So that's the highest possible need you could possibly imagine. Road and rail freight don't have quite that level of attention, but as we will go on, at least they do have a good need statement. The second thing that National Policy Statement does is set out what developers should cover in their applications. There are regulations that list a whole load of documents, but the National Policy Statement not only suggest a few extra documents, but they also say what the existing documents should have in them, a bit more detail, rather than just saying an environmental statement. It gives a bit more on what the environmental statement should assess, which is helpful. And the third main thing an NPS does is say how the Secretary of State, for transport in this case, should decide applications. So it's worth reading that bit if you're a developer making an application, because you will obviously want to tailor your application so that the decision is positive. So the current consultation, I've just put in a link to the existing National Policy Statement. That was designated, which is the word for sort of made official, like a local plan being adopted, if you like, back in January 2015, so over 8 years ago. Initially, it was expected that NPSs would be revised about every 5 years, so we're well overdue with this one. The energy ones were designated in 2011, and they're only being consulted on now, so that's even worse. So consider yourself lucky that you got a new one in a mere 8 years. So the consultation and the draft of the revised NPS came out on the 14th of March, and the consultation lasts until the 6th of June. So there is still plenty of time to read everything and put in a submission. There are 4 main things in the suite of consultation documents. There's a sort of covering document explaining in rather general terms what has changed since the previous NPS. There is the revised new NPS itself. There is a habitats regulations assessment and an appraisal of sustainability. These are the 2 things that are legally required. But necessarily, given that there's no locations are listed in the NPS at all, they have to be rather general because they don't even know what habitats are involved. So I wouldn't bother reading those. But the revised draft NPS is obviously very important. I have actually used we've got some software that compares 2 documents, a bit like a sort of track change Word document, and have created a comparison between the old one and the new one, and I put it on Google Drive. So if you click that link there, you will be able to see that. Put my name at the bottom just so that if you ever use it, I will know. Right. As with most in fact all revised NPSs to date, it says that the existing NPS continues to have effect. It doesn't get suspended or anything. However, the new one, a bit like a local plan getting more and more advanced towards adoption, the longer the new one is out and the more it gets revised, the more relevant and important it will become in future decisions, even before it gets formally designated to replace the old one. Okay. There is an important parliamentary stage of considering NPSs, it is the Transport Select Committee, as is normal, the Select Committee for the government department in question is usually given the job of considering the draft NPS. So they are doing that. They have invited submissions to the committee on the NPS, and their internal deadline is the 15th of May. I give you a link to the committee webpage. I mention this because the government seems to listen to the committee's recommendations more than other submissions made to it under the general consultation. So I think it is worth making a submission to the committee and possibly offering yourself to be a witness at a committee hearing on the new draft. That's a better way of getting your suggested changes actually embodied into the document than just putting your own response to the consultation in. So definitely worth noting there. Right, let's get on to what has actually changed compared with the previous draft. So I'm focusing on the differences between the two drafts rather than what the draft covers in general. I don't do this that often, but I've actually cut and pasted an image of the relevant paragraphs here because they are completely new in the new draft. They weren't at all in the old one. And they give quite positive support for rail freight compared with road freight. So the first one just describes the rail network and the use of freight. And then the second paragraph, it describes an SRFI. And it says at the end, a fully effective network of SRFIs, it will help to enable the sector to reach its full potential. So that's quite nice words in there. There is also some good words on carbon emissions, comparing rail freight with road freight particularly. So it says that rail freight reduces emissions on average by 76% per tonne kilometre compared with road. One of the most carbon efficient ways of moving goods over long distances, etc., etc. And it refers to the future of freight plan about introducing a rail freight growth target. And it says other various good things about the environmental benefits of rail freight compared to road freight. So that is good support for SRFIs there. That's all new. Going on to the first part of that I mentioned about the purpose of an NPS being a declaration of need. The new NPS draft actually pretty much uses the same words as the previous one when it comes to rail freight. It says the need for new facilities is compelling, which is a very strong word, which is good. And it says something like it's compelling for, it used to say, for the business markets it will serve, and they've removed the word business. I'm not sure that very much turns on that, so it's just talking about markets in general. I don't think that really makes much difference, although they have added some text at the bottom saying that rail SRFIs will continue to play an important role in delivering modal shift, and every effort should be made to ensure they are appropriately upgraded and improved to optimize their contribution. So that's interesting that it's not particularly talking about new facilities in that context. It's talking about upgrading existing ones. Something to bear in mind there. Okay, I think this is my last big cut and paste of actual text straight from the NPS. It's a bit more analytical after this. What is quite interesting is, given that there have been a few DCOs and some other smaller rail freight interchanges authorised by planning permission, it says something a bit about where should new ones be given that there are already some now. So these two paragraphs from separate sections both say things about that. It's worth reading these, because if you have a new one, you're probably going to have to say something about how it fits into a sort of network rather than just stealing capacity from one next door or something like that. So the first paragraph there says they should be strategically located so that there's a cross-country network. It does acknowledge there is a natural clustering of proposals in the distribution heartland of the nation, which is fairly apparent from that list of DCOs that I showed on the earlier slide. They're all pretty much in the East Midlands, with one or two exceptions. So it suggests that having SRFIs in areas where there is lesser provision might get a bit of a more favourable support. And then this later paragraph says the radial proximity of a proposed site from existing SRFIs will be considered to ensure they are strategically located. Do not abstract traffic from an extant SRFI. I mean, I don't see why there shouldn't be some competition in the network, but I think it would be better if you demonstrate that you are serving an unmet need rather than an already met need. So that's all that stuff about location in relation to existing SRFIs. In making an application for a SRFI development consent order, it does suggest a few things you should include in your application that it didn't used to say. First of all, and I could do an entire presentation on this subject alone, biodiversity net gain is going to become a legal obligation for town and country planning this November 2023, and for DCOs in a further 2 years, November 2025. Basically, every planning application from this year and DCO 2 years later is going to have to provide at least 10% more biodiversity than it is using up, which is quite a revolution in planning that is rather heralded, if you ask me. So this is actually almost more important to know for the moment if you're not a DCO, but you are a planning application where you're going to make your application after November 2023, because you are going to have to provide biodiversity net gain. Even before it becomes the law for DCOs, it does suggest that you're going to have to at least calculate how much you're providing and submit that with your application, presumably to try and incentivize you to provide some sort of gain rather than just loss. So that's the first thing to note. I've given paragraph references there all the way through so that you can look up the actual text when you get these slides. On design, it adds an extra thing about having a design champion or even a design panel, and saying that in your application, how marvelous your design is going to be because you've consulted various professionals on it. 2 things on climate change. The first one is, if there is climate change and there's more flooding and more weather issues and also all that sort of thing, you're going to have to demonstrate you're resilient to that in your application. So probably particularly if you're near the coast, although rail freight interchanges do not tend to be near the coast because then they aren't in the heart of transport and supply of logistics and what have you. But if you are in a flood zone, maybe you ought to demonstrate that you are resistant to additional flooding. Also on carbon, it suggests you actually provide a carbon management plan. I'll say a bit more about carbon impacts on the next slide. It seems to be very concerned with the welfare of HGV drivers. This is mentioned in several places in the new draft. So you're going to say how you're going to improve workforce conditions in your application. A couple more things. Say a bit more on your impact on the local transport network. So this is obviously the HGV rather than the rail side of things. If they are going to subsequently go on local roads, you need to assess, there's a bit more language on assessing that impact. And it refers to a rather old circular on this subject that you might have to look at. Given that it says the purpose of strategic rail freight interchanges is to facilitate modal shift of freight from road to rail, it wants you to demonstrate that you're doing that, or that your project will do that. And indeed, it says your scheme will only be permitted where it achieves modal shift. and that the rail facilities will come forward in a timely manner. So no road-only really schemes allowed, apparently. However, having said that, and remember I mentioned the East Midlands Gateway where the inspectors were not convinced that the rail facilities would come forward at all, they have slightly relaxed the language about when the rail facilities should be in place. They don't have to be there immediately. Given this paragraph, the Secretary of State recognises that applicants may need to deliver warehousing ahead of the final delivery of connections to the rail network. So as long as they are still brought forward in a timely manner, they don't have to be brought forward from the very start. So that's a slight relaxation of what it used to say, and is probably partly because of what happened on the East Midlands Gateway project. Right, a bit more on how things will be environmentally assessed. First, I note that the environmental impact regime, assessment regime itself, is going to be completely changed in 2 or 3 years' time to a new concept called environmental outcomes reports. This is currently going through Parliament in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, so it's not even been enacted yet. And again, this could be the subject, and indeed in my case has been the subject of a separate webinar. If you look on my firm's YouTube channel, you'll be able to see a presentation on biodiversity net gain and another one on environmental outcomes reports. So bear that in mind, that the whole thing is changing, but on the assumption that we're carrying on with environmental impact assessment that we know and love, the revised draft has some changes in terms of environmental assessment. First one is there's stronger text on air quality impacts. So that may be relevant, particularly on the HGV, pollution coming from HGVs, occasioned by your new project. And there is more on saying that you need to do whole life assessment of carbon emissions. And I think the main point of this is that that includes construction emissions. You can't just sit back and say, oh, the Department of Transport has got a transport decarbonisation policy, so railways, cars, HGVs will all eventually be decarbonised and become zero emission vehicles. Anyway, that's going to happen anyway, so there's nothing we need to do about it. That may be so for operation, but you are going to have to assess your carbon construction impacts as well. And that is something you can control and could improve probably. So don't just use normal construction techniques, but at least have a look at low carbon techniques there. There is stronger text on the loss of irreplaceable habitat, the classic example of which is ancient woodland. Obviously, if you plant some new trees to replace ancient woodland, they won't be ancient for a very long time. So it is technically irreplaceable, and you should really avoid affecting ancient woodland pretty much at all costs. There's stronger text on that. Whoops. This is partly linked to climate resilience, climate change resilience, but there is a whole new series of tests in planning about flood risk that you before you locate your development in a high risk area, you need to show that you tried all the low risk areas, but they weren't suitable. Essentially, there's a sort of sequential test. So there's a bit about that. I thought it was interesting that it says, when you consider the landscape impact, so this is what people can see of your facility from distance and close up. If they are severe impacts, it does suggest that that should be, you might consider having a smaller facility to offset those impacts. So that's something to bear in mind. And inevitably, rail freight facilities are often located in the green belt, and the text on green belt development has been slightly strengthened. It's not a huge difference, but worth reading that bit as well. Okay, that concludes what I think are the main differences between the old text and the new text. So here I just speculate a bit before we go on to answering any questions you might have about what you might say in the response to the consultation about how it could be even better. So if energy projects get a very even stronger need case, why can't rail freight ones get one? I mean, the pandemic demonstrated how important the continued resilient delivery of essential supplies, food, medicine, all sorts of things was, even when we were all, or particularly when we were all locked down, and things like that might happen in the future. So perhaps there is the need case for SRFIs could be expressed even more strongly. Is the text on locations for development adequate? Is it inhibiting anyone's plans because of the way it says, we don't like you to be right next to somebody else? But then if you're the somebody else, you might not want the new person to come next to you either. So consider that text and whether the text ought to be a bit more general about locations so that anyone's potential project is not inhibited by the way it has been expressed. While there's been some relaxation on rail connections, and they don't have to be in place from the get-go, some of these projects are phased over quite a long time. So perhaps it could, I just thought it might say something allowing that, perhaps being a bit more relaxed about phased developments, and perhaps suggesting that the DCO, which might allow the phasing, could phase the rail connections or something like that, or just so that you don't have to provide more than you need when you need it. And finally, I've really been talking about the rail freight specific sections of the National Policy Statement, but of course it covers road and rail projects on their own separately. And it might be worth reading the rail section because it's always been a complaint of the rail freight sector that it's all about passengers. And perhaps although I haven't covered this in this presentation, you could check what it says about need for facilities and for rail facilities and try and increase the need for rail freight and the sharing of the railway by freight and not just make it all about passengers. That's probably not such an issue on the road network because the strategic road network that National Highways looks after is recognised to be predominantly used by HGVs, so it hasn't got such a share of the road issue as there is a share of the railway. Right, that was fairly whistle-stop run canter through the new consultation, new draft. I shall stop sharing my slides there. That's in 30 minutes. So we now have up to 30 minutes to have a discussion.
Incredibly helpful. Just as a point of detail, if you were able to send us the link over to your YouTube channel, we could certainly send that out to people with the slides, and that'd be really good, so people can pick up on those more detailed points around biodiversity and the environmental assessments as well. That'd be brilliant. Thank you. I've got one question, and then I'm going to ask one or two people just to come in from there. So if you are listening in, please be aware that I will allow you to speak shortly if you've got questions that you want to raise. But one of the things that struck me when reading it was that obviously, as you said, it says more about whole life carbon, but across the document as a whole, it felt to me that carbon was quite underplayed as a topic, particularly in the relationship between, for an SRFI, how you would measure that when many of your carbon savings weren't on site but elsewhere in the economy. Do you think it's strong enough on carbon?
I think the Secretary of State for Transport is trying to separate out the sort of national policy on net zero and carbon reduction and take it away as much as they can from planning, but I don't think you can remove it entirely from planning considerations. So there is this transport decarbonisation plan that came out about a year ago, which says how net zero will be achieved in the various transport modes. Perhaps not aviation, but that's for another day. But I don't think you can entirely divorce planning carbon impacts from planning decisions, and you will have to say something. I mean, it does even say that you've got to have a carbon management plan in your application. So I think there will be some sort of assessment. And as you say, rail freight facilities will hopefully improve the carbon position by creating modal shift, or encouraging at least. And so perhaps you can, at least at the operational stage, include in your carbon management plan note that you will be, the mere existence of and use of the facility will reduce carbon impacts compared with what would have happened if it hadn't been there, as part of that, and use that as a positive, as a benefit of the project. Does that sort of answer your question?
There were plenty of places where things like the Future of Freight plan were mentioned, and obviously there's a stack of DFT documents in that the Future of Freight plan refers to the transport decarbonisation plan in places, but it wasn't mentioned where I thought it might be mentioned, and that might be something I think that we'll pick up, because it's going to be more difficult for people if that network-wide benefit isn't more explicitly picked up, I think.
Well, perhaps the NPS could say that you should assess what you consider to be the carbon impacts of the savings that the modal shift will cause. Yeah. But even if it doesn't say it, you can put that in your application anyway.
Well, indeed so. Yeah, cool. Colleagues who are on, I have allowed you to talk. Peter, I don't know whether you wanted to reflect on anything, because I know from our previous conversations that you've looked at, obviously you've had experience of this and then looked at it in some detail.
Yes, Maggie, that's great. Thanks. Peter Frost from Kilbride Group, so we involved with the West Midlands interchange principally. Angus, thanks for, hi Angus, thanks for that. It's a really good run through the highlights there. I had one query and a couple of other quirky ones, short ones. So on the transition process, the rules that apply to the transition to the new NPS, I was a bit confused having read it on paragraph 117, how relevant the new draft NPS is going to be in decision making up to the point that the new NPS is approved, because in the text it says the new NPS will not kick in until it has received formal approval or consent from Parliament. But it seemed a bit open-ended. And then two quick points really was, there's obviously, you mentioned the reference to the rail freight growth target, which is great news, but just so everyone is aware, it doesn't exist at the moment, and it's pretty unclear how that's going to be brought in or where, because it may be, well, anyway, there's a lot of debate going on about whether government likes it, but how are they actually going to introduce a rail freight growth target? And the other one to watch out for, I thought, was it says that SRFIs will be liable for SIL in the future, which was a little unkind, and people may wish to oppose that one, bearing in mind there are massive Section 106 obligations that are set up in combination with most DCOs, where there is usually, not always, but usually quite a big financial contribution being put together around the specific project.
Okay, I will attempt to answer those, but I'm not sure. I probably don't know the answer to your middle question. So on the first one about transition from the old one to the new one. It's slightly using terms of art that are used in the Planning Act itself. The decision-making section of Section 104, it says projects should be approved if they are in line with the relevant national policy statement. That's the starting point. And so that the one referred to in that part of the section will remain the current one until the new one is designated. So the starting point will still be the old one in terms of the presumption of approval if you comply with it. But then later in that same section, it says that other things can be taken into account in reaching a decision. Any documents, for example, or any matters that the Secretary of State considers important and relevant. And so that's what in the new draft, what it's saying about, or in the consultation document, that the new draft may well be considered important and relevant. So it's a subsidiary thing that will be taken into account in decisions until it eventually gets designated and becomes the starting point one, if you see what I mean. I mean, it is quite similar to local plans. As they move towards adoption, they get more and more weight attached to them because they've been through more of a process of consideration and challenge and amendment. It's not quite the same for national policy statements because they don't get gradually amended over time. They'll just be this draft, and then there'll be a final draft probably in about a year's time that will almost be exactly the same as the one that gets designated. So it's not quite as gradual. But I imagine applicants will be asked, if they don't say so in their application, or asked during examination, if they could say whether they consider that they comply with the new NPS as well as the old one. So that's that. On your where will the rail freight growth target be embodied? I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Nobody knows.
Does Maggie's more likely to know than me, and she doesn't know, so there we are. That means no one knows. Maggie doesn't know. And the third one about SIL, another thing to bear in mind, in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, SIL is being replaced by removing the C from it, so it's going to be an infrastructure levy instead of a community infrastructure levy. So that will be an entirely new regime with it won't be entirely new, it'll look quite like the old one, but it's going to be more of a tariff approach that will be used for large planning applications and DCOs indeed. So watch that space. But if your project involves buildings that people normally go into, which is a sort of test for SIL, then you might attract SIL. So you could try and argue that the general public do not go into rail freight facilities, and so you shouldn't have SIL. You shouldn't have to pay SIL. You are infrastructure. You're supposed to be the beneficiaries of SIL, not the payers of SIL. So where are you getting from getting that rail freight facilities should have to pay SIL?
It was paragraph 4.9. Okay.
I must have missed that. Was that?
I might have got that wrong, but that's...
No, I doubt you've got it wrong. I really focused on the old text, only changes from the old text, so it may have been in the old one as well. Let me just look at paragraph 4.9. Sorry about this.
That's all. Whilst Angus looks, Peter, just on a separate point, Angus mentioned the multiple references throughout to providing lorry facilities for HGV drivers. Is that something that was already sort of in people's plans, or is this a new thing? Because it read to me as if DFT were making quite a thing of that, given the difficulties we know around those facilities.
Yeah, they seem to be pushing towards effectively something close to new truck stops, which wouldn't help the air quality assessments at all. It would concentrate. So that's probably not good news, but most of the more recent WMIs have had some form of provision anyway. So Durft tagged on effectively a truck stop just up the road. And I think some of the other sites we certainly have included facilities of the type they've mentioned. But it is tricky being forced to do that, depending on which air quality zone you're in.
And is that, I mean, I know it's an impossible question to say, is it only for drivers who are using the SRFI rather than anybody else? Is there any granularity around that? Yeah,
so that's the sensitive bit, because you could be attracting all sorts of other vehicles onto the site that have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, I've had to thank you for allowing me to play for time, mate. 4.9, yes, there is a new sentence at the end of paragraph 4.9 that says community infrastructure levy or any successor to it. So they're obviously mindful of this new infrastructure levy may be payable. So at least it only says may rather than will. So I think it's just a case of arguing that it doesn't apply because it's not like residential development or commercial development where the public would generally go. But that could be a point in the on your response to the consultation to say, could you please remove that sentence as it suggests it would be payable when it really oughtn't to be payable.
Lovely, thanks, Angus.
Okay.
Miles, Richard, Robin, any questions or points you'd like to raise?
No, thank you very much. Very comprehensive and very helpful.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, same here. No, thank you. I find it quite useful. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Cool. Okay, so then, just by way of conclusion, Angus, do you think this is better or worse than the previous?
I think it's slightly better actually, in terms of the need and recognizing the modal shift element of rail freight. And in fact, freight in general gets quite a good coverage, positive coverage compared to the previous draft.
Yeah.
So I think it is an improvement, but it could always be improved even more. And I recommend, I mean, particularly the RFG might wish to submit something to the Transport Select Committee.
Yeah.
By the 15th of May is the deadline.
Yeah.
And then they might ask you to appear and you can put your case orally, which means it carry even more weight. Oh, Miles has his hand up.
Yeah, Miles.
Yeah, sorry. When can we get access to the slides?
Oh yeah, if you just drop me an email, Miles, I'll just put my email address in the chat and then Angus can send them to me and
yeah, I'll send them to you as soon as we've finished.
Okay, thank you.
If you just drop me an email, because I'm not sure I've got your email address, Miles, then you can, I'll just get those across to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And as I said, we'll put the recording up on our YouTube as well, so you can share that with colleagues or whatever. Yeah. Lovely. Okay, in which case, if there are no more questions, I'll just say a huge thank you to Angus for that presentation and also for the work behind it, which I'm shamelessly going to steal now as I start to draft our response. It was incredibly helpful, as always. It's, you know, it's a really complicated area, but a really important area, and one that I think, you know, has been a huge policy success in recent years, and which we need to continue to be a huge policy success going forward. So Angus and colleagues, thank you very much for your time. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you online at another webinar soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye for now.